Part 1. The Rot Within the Woodwork. The Valley of Oakhaven did not merely suffer the late summer heat. It choked on it. The air hung stagnant and heavy, smelling perpetually of boiling cabbage, wet ash, and the slow, inevitable rot of the surrounding marshlands. Inside the warped timber walls of their ancestral cottage, the humidity felt like a physical weight pressing against the chest. Elara knelt on the splintering floorboards, a coarse bristle brush gripped so tightly in her hands that her knuckles bled of color. Sweat traced a slow, stinging path down her spine, pooling at the waistband of a rough-spun skirt that had been mended until more patch than original fabric remained. Her breathing was rhythmic, a shallow hiss puff through gritted teeth, synchronized with the agonizing scrape of the brush against the grimed wood. Across the cramped room, lounging upon the only piece of furniture that still held a semblance of velvet upholstery, sat Lysandra. Where Elara was all soft, bruised edges and quiet submission, Lysandra was a study in predatory angles. Her spine was rigidly straight, untouched by the labor that had bowed her sister's shoulders. She held a sliver of polished glass, a broken shard from a mirrored compact long dead, angling it to catch the weak, jaundiced light filtering through the grime-caked window. "You missed a spot," Lysandra murmured. Her voice was smooth, carrying the deceptive languor of a coiled viper. She did not look up from her reflection, a solitary manicured fingernail tracing the line of her high, sharp cheekbone. Elara paused. A bead of sweat dropped from her brow, fracturing against the wet wood. She closed her eyes, her chest rising in a long, silent intake of the suffocating air. "I will fetch the water next," Elara said, her voice barely a scrape of sound, sanded down by years of appeasement. "The bucket is dry." "See that you do," Lysandra replied, finally lowering the glass. Her dark eyes locked onto Elara's hunched form. There was no pity in her gaze, only the cold, hard calculation of a master appraising a draft horse. "And do not dawdle. The dust in this wretched hovel is coating my throat." The boundaries of their world were etched into these very floorboards. Lysandra, consumed by a festering resentment for the nobility she believed she was owed. Elara, anchoring herself to the desperate belief that survival required only endurance. The silence between them was never empty. It was packed with the unspoken, jagged debris of 1,000 childhood resentments. Part 2. The Weight of Water and Words. The path to the village well was a mile of cracked earth and dying razor grass. The sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil. Elara dragged the heavy iron-bound oak bucket, the coarse rope biting familiar grooves into her calloused palms. When she reached the stone lip of the well, her vision swam with exhaustion. As she hauled the dripping bucket upward, the wooden crank groaning in protest, A shadow detached itself from the copse of dead willows nearby. It was an old woman. Her skin was a tapestry of deep, ash-colored fissures, and she leaned upon a twisted hawthorn staff, her breathing a wet, rattling wheeze. A sip, child. The woman's voice was the rustle of dry autumn leaves. My throat is dust. Elara did not hesitate. Though her own mouth felt stuffed with cotton, she hoisted the heavy bucket, tilting it carefully so the woman could drink from the moss-slicked rim. Elara's arms trembled under the weight, muscles burning, but she held steady until the woman pulled away, a single drop of clear water clinging to her weathered chin. You have a spine of iron and a heart of spun glass, the old woman whispered, her pale eyes suddenly sharp, piercing the hazy afternoon light. For the sweetness of your labor, let your breath yield what your hands have earned. Elara blinked, but the woman was already receding, melting back into the dappled shade of the willows. When Elara finally pushed open the heavy oak door of the cottage, the sun was beginning to bleed red across the horizon. Lysandra stood by the hearth, foot tapping an erratic, impatient rhythm against the stone. You took an eternity? Lysandra snapped, her upper lip curling. Did you stop to count the pebbles on the road? Elara opened her mouth to apologize. I am sore. A sharp, crystalline clatter shattered the heavy atmosphere. Elara gasped, clamping a hand over her mouth. Lysandra froze. Rolling across the warped floorboards, catching the red light of the dying sun, was a ruby the size of a robin's egg. Beside it, fluttering softly to the ground, was a pristine, dew-kissed white rose petal. Lysandra's eyes widened, the dark pupils swallowing her irises. She stepped forward, her breath catching in her throat. She sank to her knees, heedless of the dirt, and snatched the ruby. Her fingers trembled as she held it to the light. It was flawless. Ooh, ooh. Speak, Lysandra demanded, her voice dropping to a hoarse, guttural whisper. Her gaze snapped up to Elara, stripped of all languor, blazing with an avarice so raw it made Elara step backward. Speak again. Now. I don't. Clink. Clatter. A perfect spherical pearl and a sprig of fragrant jasmine tumbled from Elara's lips, bouncing against the toes of her battered boots. Lysandra lunged forward, her hands scrambling over the wood to hoard the treasures. Her breathing became rapid, shallow. The air in the room seemed to compress, pulling taut like a drawn bowstring. Who did this? Lysandra hissed, rising slowly, her fists clutching the jewels. Where did you get this? Tell me everything. Do not leave out a single breath. Elara, terrified by the manic gleam in her sister's eyes, recounted the old woman at the well. With every terrified word she spoke, the floor filled with diamonds, emeralds, bluebells, and lilies. The smell of rotting wood was entirely overwhelmed by the cloying, intoxicating scent of a royal greenhouse. A beggar, Lysandra muttered, her mind visibly racing behind her eyes. Her fingers dug into Elara's shoulders, her nails biting into the thin fabric. Tomorrow, I will go to the well. Part 3: The Shattering. Dawn broke like a bruised peach. Lysandra stood before the broken mirror shard, arranging a silk shawl, a hoarded relic from their deceased mother, around her shoulders. She carried the finest silver pitcher they owned, polishing it until her reflection glared back at her. She would not drag a filthy wooden bucket. She was a queen stepping out to claim her crown. When she arrived at the well, the heat was already rising. She stood tall, chin tipped upward, waiting. But no beggar emerged from the willows. Instead, the air shimmered, and from the path leading to the high road stepped a woman dressed in silks the color of a midnight storm, adorned in silver filigree. She carried the bearing of an empress. Maiden, the noblewoman said, her voice carrying the cold resonance of striking steel. I have traveled far, and my flask is dry. Will you draw water for me? Lysandra's jaw clenched. Her eyes darted around, looking for the crone Elara had described. This woman was no beggar. She was competition. Lysandra's pride, carefully nurtured in the squalor of her home, reared up like a striking cobra. Do I look like a scullery maid? Lysandra scoffed, her voice dripping with acidic contempt. She tightened her grip on the silver pitcher. The well is there. The bucket is there. If your hands are too delicate to touch the rope, then perhaps you should have brought your own servants. I am not here to serve you. The noblewoman went entirely still. The ambient sounds of the marsh, the cicadas, the wind in the reeds, ceased instantly. Ooh, indeed. The woman said softly, the illusion of her nobility melting away to reveal the ancient, terrifying depth in her eyes. You serve only yourself. For the venom in your heart, let your breath yield what your soul has cultivated. Lysandra laughed, a harsh, grating sound, and spun on her heel, marching back toward the cottage, furious and empty-handed. She slammed the cottage door open, the wood cracking against the hinges. Elara jumped up from the hearth, where a small pile of diamonds and orchids had gathered by her feet. Nothing. Lysandra screamed, her face flushed with rage, the veins in her neck bulging. There was no beggar, only some arrogant, preening harlot who demanded Lysandra choked. Her eyes bulged. Her hands flew to her throat, her chest heaving as a wet, suffocating, gagging sound tore from her lungs. She doubled over, coughing violently. Elara rushed forward. Lysandra. What is? Lysandra's jaw unhinged with a sickening pop. A thick, muscular coil of green scales slithered from between her lips. The serpent dropped heavily to the floor, instantly hissing and baring venomous fangs. A heartbeat later, a massive, warty toad fell from her mouth with a wet, heavy thud, leaving a trail of dark, foul-smelling slime down her chin. Elara screamed, scrambling backward, pressing her spine against the stone of the hearth. Lysandra collapsed to her knees, gagging, tears of absolute terror streaming down her face. She tried to scream, to ask for help, to curse the world. But every syllable birthed a nightmare. Elara. She tried to cry out. Thump. Hiss. A black-bellied viper and a cluster of writhing millipedes spilled over her lower lip. The cottage erupted into pandemonium. Elara's panicked cries, "Please, stop! Help!" showered the room with sapphires and weeping willows, the heavy gemstones crashing into the slithering serpents. Lysandra, driven mad by the invasion of her own body, clawed at her mouth, spitting toads and vipers that scrambled over the mounting piles of treasure. The claustrophobic room became a terrifying terrarium of miraculous wealth and venomous rot. Lysandra looked up at Elara, her eyes begging, but her chest convulsed with another furious sob. She hated Elara in that moment more than she ever had. Hated her for the diamonds that fell as Elara wept. Hated her for the purity of her fear. Lysandra tried to scream her hatred, but only choked on the cold, scaly length of another snake. Part 4. The Silent Ruin. The frenzy eventually broke, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence broken only by the wet croaking of amphibians and the dry rustle of scales against jewels. Lysandra sat curled in the corner, her knees drawn tightly to her chest. Her beautiful silk shawl was stained with slime and bile. She clamped her hands over her mouth, her body shuddering with silent, violent sobs. To speak was to suffer. To express her pain was to manifest monsters. The psychological horror of her imprisonment settled over her like a lead shroud. She was locked inside her own mind, terrified of her own voice. Elara sat a few feet away, her hands trembling in her lap. Between them lay the physical manifestation of their souls. A grotesque, tangled pile of glittering rubies, delicate magnolias, writhing vipers, and bloated toads. Lysandra, Elara whispered, the word dropping a single, perfect silver pearl onto the floor. Lysandra flinched, turning her head away, her eyes squeezing shut. The pearl rolled across the floor, stopping near the snout of a resting serpent. Elara realized then the full cruelty of the magic. Her attempts to soothe, her words of comfort, would only ever highlight the devastating contrast between them. Every time she tried to speak words of love, she would shower her sister with the very wealth Lysandra had coveted and lost. Her presence, her voice, had become an instrument of psychological torture. The old paradigms of their lives, the bitter sister demanding, the quiet sister appeasing, were utterly obliterated. Lysandra had craved power and control through her sharp tongue. Now, her tongue was the agent of her own horror. Part 5. The Departure. Elara stood up. The worn fabric of her skirt brushed against a pile of emeralds. She looked around the dilapidated cottage, recognizing that this structure could no longer hold them both. There was no equilibrium to be found together. She walked slowly toward the door. Lysandra watched her from the corner, her dark eyes wide and frantic over the cage of her own hands. Elara paused at the threshold, placing her hand on the iron latch. She looked back at her sister one final time. She did not speak. She knew better now. Instead, she offered a slow, mournful nod, a silent acknowledgement of the tragedy, an apology she could not voice, and a farewell. Elara stepped out into the clearing mist of the morning, the heavy door clicking shut behind her. With every step she took down the dirt path away from Oakhaven, she hummed a quiet, wordless tune, leaving a trail of blooming snowdrops in the dust to mark her passage into the unknown. Back inside the dim, stifling cottage, Lysandra remained in the corner. She slowly lowered her hands from her mouth. The silence of the empty house pressed in on her. She stared at the warped wooden floorboards in front of her. There, illuminated by a single shaft of sunlight piercing the grime of the window, rested a flawless, glittering diamond. Coiled tightly around it, its cold scales motionless, was a dead, shriveled serpent. Great job today. Remember, small daily progress is the secret to fluency. Keep practicing, and I'll see you in the next video.